Valcha, welcome back to Irish Granny. Surviving Death, Part 4. Chapter 20, Interactive Apparitions by Lloyd Arbach, MS. This is also has been discussed by Dr. Peter Fenwick, who we're familiar with, when he visited with the dying. It's been seriously studied. It's been seriously documented for more than a century. Collective apparitions are seen by multiple witnesses at the same time or several witnesses at different times. They can affect any or all of the senses, and pets are often aware of them. Lloyd Arbach has a master's in parapsychology. I wish I'd known years ago you could get a master's in that. He studied it for more than 35 years. Ghost encounters are a topic of serious research. And, the stuff you see on TV, many famous books, many famous articles and journals. But the word ghost has cultural baggage. And in the old days, they used to call them phantasms, but now serious researchers prefer to call them apparitions. But they're not only visual. They can interact with us and with the environment. They can move objects. The belief is it's some aspect of a dead human surviving the body, and it must be able to communicate to be evidential. You can't just say, "Oh, I saw a ghost," and that's good enough. No. So here we go. So this is a report, an early report from William Barrett, a physicist and parapsychologist. Happened in 1892. The first Thursday in April 1881, while sitting at tea with my back to the window and talking with my wife in the usual way, I plainly heard a rap at the window and looked around at the window. And I said to my wife, "Why, there's my grandmother." And I went to the door, but I could not see anyone. Still feeling sure it was my grandmother, and knowing, he saw her, that she was 83 years of age and very active and fond of a joke, I went round the house but couldn't see anyone. My wife did not hear it, and on following Saturday I had news my grandmother died in Yorkshire about a half an hour before the time I heard the rapping and saw her. The last time I saw her alive, I promised, if well, I would attend her funeral. That was some 2 years before. I was in good health and had no trouble. Aged 26 years, I did not know that my grandmother was dead. And she had promised to appear to him at her death. Deathbed apparitions are sometimes people that the dying people don't know, or people that the dying people didn't know were dead. They talk about this one young woman who was dying, and her sister had died the week before, but they didn't tell her. And here was the sister appearing to her. So sometimes an apparition is a place memory. I thought this was really interesting. It's a kind of an echo. They talk about a place being haunted. The energy of somebody can be locked into repetitive behaviors in a place, and they're not communicative, but they're attached to the place. And sometimes a place can be haunted and they are communicative. It's intentional on the part of the entity. But sometimes it's more like a hologram. It's more like a feedback loop. You're just seeing the same thing happen. Like I remember when I was younger, I read a book that had photographs, supposedly, of monks walking along a corridor in a monastery, an ancient monastery. These were ancient ghost monks, supposedly. Well, that would be an example of that. Places hold the memory and the energies of their history, and our psychic ability can pick up on it. It's like a video loop. They seem to have been made by the environment, but while they were alive. It's not the dead people. They can't interact, and they're not an evidence of survival. You need communication of some sort to make it evidence. And this can happen in telepathic form across both living and dead. Now, Lloyd Arbach, who contributed heavily to this book, started out as a skeptic. In 1985. So this is about an ongoing apparition. This is really weird. Began shortly after the woman in this couple, her grandfather died. She was extremely close to him. They lived on the second floor of a two-family house. They would hear footsteps coming up the stairs, the lock being turned, the door opening, the door closing, the footsteps coming in and ending up in the children's bedroom, the nursery, or going straight to their room. They'd go out and look, and they wouldn't see anybody. They wouldn't hear footsteps anymore, and this was a repeated pattern. They'd see apparitions of this individual, and some of them were clear sightings, very concrete seeming, to the point where people who were visiting would say, "Who's that in the house?" Other times just vague shadows would be seen. They determined on their own it was her grandfather. So they brought in these mediums, and they all were able to give a good description of what he looked like, things that had occurred, where the phenomena had occurred. They were really able to nail it down. And the family moved recently, and the phenomena are still continuing in their new location, which suggests it's person-related rather than house-related. And the psychics all told them the grandfather was watching over them. He's not earthbound. He knows he's dead. He's just keeping an eye on the family. And the baby, a few months old, would be lying in its crib, and the blanket would be off, but then they'd find the blanket tucked up on him. So there's a woman who's an attorney, and she called the parapsychology program, very concerned. She learned that her son had been having conversations with a ghost that he identified as that of the woman who had been the previous owner of the home. She also learned that these almost daily conversations had been going on for well over a year. They purchased the more than 70-year-old home a couple of years after the 1980 death by natural causes of the owner, who had lived in the house since her birth in 1917. They had bought also some of the original furniture. And so the son, I'm gonna condense this a little bit. They'd all see her. After they realized the son was talking to her, she would be in different clothes. She'd be different ages. And the son would say that she'd sit and talk, and he had all kinds of information about this woman. Where did he get it? There was nothing written down, private family stuff. And she helped him with his homework. So it all came to a head when he talked about the furniture and was able to tell where they'd come from and who owned them and where they bought them. And the mother said, "Well, how do you know all this?" And the son said, "Lois told me." And the mom said, "Who's Lois?" "You know, Lois, the ghost, the one you've been seeing walking around the house since we moved in here." And so they had not known what to make of this woman they kept seeing. You know, if I saw a strange woman in my house, I'd be more than just casually curious. But they brought in the medium, and sure enough, the medium talked to this entity. And yes, it was the woman who used to own the house, and she had nothing malicious. She loved the house. She liked the people. And she was sticking around because she liked them. And they treated her house well, and she thought that she liked the kid a lot. And she helped him with his homework, and they sit and chat. That's just unbelievable. Anyway, that's that story. I'm condensing it on the interests of time. So they sat around together with these psychics. I'd forgotten this. They sat with these psychics around the room in a circle, and they left an empty chair, and the psychics would ask a question, and the boy would turn to the empty chair, and then he'd give them the answer, and they were able to verify all this stuff. She said that she was a ball of energy, and she could project her thoughts into others and include the ability into their thoughts to think that they were seeing her. It's called perceptive insertion. And she'd been telling Chris's mind what to perceive. And her sense of herself was how she felt at any given day. So she would appear to the other members of the family just as the older woman that she had been, but to him, depending on the conversations that he would have, she would make him think of her as like a 40-year-old or a 20-year-old or a little girl or whatever, but he knew, that it was her all the time. And then they asked, well, why don't you move on? And she says, well, I like these guys. They treat the house well, but I did too much partying in my youth, and I'm a little afraid of what's going to meet me on the other side. I didn't do enough church going. And so they just discussed stuff about their personal lives, and they got information from her. They were able to connect with her last living cousin, who verified all kinds of facts. So she hung around for years, and others did see her. Chris was tested and had no psychic abilities at all. So then Leslie had an apparition. Here we go. At the Moss Beach Distillery in San Francisco, there's an apparition called the Blue Lady that's been seen since the early 30s. The place has been systematically studied by this institute for 10 years. And one night, Leslie was there alone. She was volunteering for them in the interests of researching the book. And they were setting up equipment. She was alone. She was setting up equipment, a magnetometer. And it started spiking, like a change in magnetic energy in the room. And she felt a weird tingling and a rippling twice. And the Blue Lady was walking through her to get her attention. And she knows this because while it was happening, 3 of the mediums arrived who were expected and weren't there yet. They arrived and walked in just in time to see this Blue Lady walk through Leslie. And all 3 were interviewed separately and described exactly the same thing. And it matched how Leslie felt. There are many sightings of military people on the USS Hornet, which is now dry docked and it's used as a museum. The apparitions are aware of and interact with the witnesses, the tourists, on the boat. And they told, through mediums, that the apparitions were not soldiers who died on the USS Hornet. They were people who had served on the ship. So the debate in science is not necessarily, do these phenomena exist? They have a ton of documented evidence that they do exist. What's the real debate in science is what causes it. Is this psychic ability, or is this survival after death? So part 4, the impossible made real. Chapter 21 is the human-generated phenomena. And here's where we get really bizarre. So groups of psychics and mediums meet to get these phenomena to happen intentionally. And they do it so that they can control them, study them in a controlled environment. So there's psychokinesis, like clock stopping and somebody's death, or the tops popping off bottles to let you know that someone's communicating. We know the human mind can do all kinds of weird physical things and generate psychokinesis, for example, poltergeists. That's the human mind. These are called outbreaks of spontaneous paranormal physical phenomena centering upon the organism of some particular individual. And also known as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, poltergeists. They're caused by unconscious psychological disturbances and emotional imbalances in someone within the household, usually a troubled teen. So, all this fancy talk. You got a teenager who's having angst, and given the right set of circumstances, psychic ability, level of angst, environment of the family, weird things start happening. Like The Exorcist. Things move, objects appear and disappear, doors bang, noises, random noises, just weird stuff. And what this is stress relief through telekinetic temper tantrum that affects the physical environment. You'll get percussive sounds, you get objects tilting, knocked over, thrown. Things will get thrown. In 1979, Gould and Corin wrote a book called Poltergeist with 500 cases. Ian Stevenson recorded discarnate agency sometimes that if it's experienced by more than one person, he says, this may be an entity, somebody dead or something dead, and not the release of energy, psychokinesic energy from a living person. They don't know. It's a debate. It's been documented by groups of psychics, and it's been documented that groups of psychics can make this stuff happen. They can sit down and intentionally make it happen. And this has been studied over and over and over. Scientifically, it's agreed. Yes, this all exists. This is not fooling around. It's not a con job. It's not fraud. It's no one's imagination. They're not mentally ill. They're not doing it for a TV show. In a laboratory, under controlled conditions, with the right mediums and psychics, they can make this stuff happen, and they can do it over and over and document it and record it. They just don't know why. Psychologists who studied it said that anyone can learn how to do it. Sessions with mediums and a circle of people can do things like raise a table up in the middle of the room. Psychokinesis, visitation of an entity, they don't know. They've studied sound waves of rappings, and they differ from regular rappings. So you get, I don't know what the machine is, but they'll record somebody knocking on a block of wood. And then there'll be this weird psychic block, paranormal knocking on the same block of wood. And the actual sound waves are different. Now we're getting into physics. Don't ask me to explain. The differences are always consistent, and when there is a difference, it's always the same kind of difference. And the expert says it's not like sound, but it's more like a buildup of stress in the material. It comes from the actual block of wood itself. They have no explanation. We simply don't know enough to explain it. They can't replicate the wave patterns of unexplained raps. They can rap, but the waves are completely different. It's more similar to seismic waves, when stress builds up in the earth. These phenomena do occur, are documented. It's just not even, there is proof. So anybody who writes to me in the comments and says, well, I'm not going to believe it until there's proof, there's proof. We don't know how to explain it, but there's proof. They know what it's not. They don't know what it is. Chapter 22, From Object Movements to Materialized Hands. Yes, I said it. Materialized hands, and it's more than that. Some mediums have been studied by scientists in strictly controlled environments, and they'll have a seance with strict controls, and strange things happen that have been recorded, documented. For example, Thomas Mann, a Nobel Prize winner, was at a seance at a baron's home with a teenage medium. Mann was impressed at the guests, professors, academics, medical professionals, and scientists. The medium dressed in glowing cloth so that you could see her in the dark. And she was held down. She was tied down, so she wasn't getting up and running around and doing weird stuff. So she went into a trance, and they saw odd things like a handkerchief held by a hand, disincarnate, hanging in the room, appeared out of nowhere. Multiple people saw it. The ringing of a bell. A trash basket levitated. The sound of typing. So this was a long time ago. 3 scientific skeptics studied an Italian medium named Eusapia Palladino in 1908. These 3 scientific skeptics had a reputation. They were called the Fraud Squad. They went from place to place and investigated all these different psychic claims and medium claims and, proved them to be frauds. Developed a reputation for being really good at it. So I put down the number on this page, and I did not mark what I wanted to read, so oh well. They looked into, the guy with the leg. They looked into that. No fraud. They looked into this other medium where hands materialized, and this Eusapia person, and no fraud. The hand touched them in the room. No fraud. A Scottish medium, Daniel Dungall's home, who was 25 years old. They studied him extensively and could find no fraud. He was also studied by Dr. William Crookes, the inventor of the cathode ray, who also saw hands floating around. No fraud. Chapter 23, Possible Evidence of Survival. Erlander Haraldsson, a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Iceland, PhD, psychiatrist, all sorts of impressive credentials, was researching parapsychology since 1972. And he researched a person who is possibly the greatest medium ever that's not well known. And his name is Indiri Indriðarsson. These names are something else. This person had drop-ins, spirit contacts that just showed up. And they each had a different independent kind of voice. Would sing in languages that were unknown to the medium. In 1905, an apprentice in Reykjavik, this medium was an apprentice in Reykjavik at the age of 22 when he started to do medium things, and he died at 28 of typhoid. But he was studied extensively. He levitated. There were weird sounds, weird lights, weird hands, weird voices. Apports. Apports are things that just appear and disappear and reappear again from someplace else. Like, I've had some experiences of this, and I swear to God, I'm not imagining this. My glasses are sitting here right now, and I know they're there. And I would look away for a few minutes, and I'd look back, and they'd be gone. And I'd go nuts, and I'd tear my house apart looking for them. I swear I knew they were sitting on that table. I'd come back in, and they'd be sitting there. Okay, somebody's got a sense of humor. Oh, very quickly, I just wanted to mention, if you want to hear my personal experiences with a couple of ghosts, I don't know what to call them, Halloween. I did a video on Halloween and I told those stories. So I think I call them ghost stories. I can't remember. But they're true and they're pretty fun. I don't want to repeat them now. But my mother was very psychic. My mother and I had some interesting experiences together. So this medium had a drop-in named Jensen who gave all sorts of identifying data, and nobody ever bothered to check and see if any of it was true. So Leslie did. She researched it and she found it was all true. So this spirit contact of this medium provided evidence. Nobody bothered to look into it. And Leslie found it was true. The medium spoke Danish at the time of the drop-in. And interestingly, this guy, Jensen, was from Copenhagen when he was alive. This direct voice phenomenon is like this Indiri guy was like voices in the room, but they're coming from nobody, and they're just from various places in the room, different, like a man, a child, a woman, two people singing, just weird voices, different languages, singing harmony, just very strange. and many languages. It's called responsive xenoglossy. One of the voices they heard said her name, and they looked her up, and it was a famous singer who had died. Chapter 24, the Enigma of Full-Form Materialization. In 1906, this discarnate, Emil Jensen, was not the only drop-in control of the medium in Dridi. Lots of story here about what this medium went through, but this is really interesting. The new visitor, Jensen, appeared to the group in the middle of the seance. Now, this is this is a room full of skeptic scientists who have locked the room. They brought in magicians to look for hidden doors and sliding windows and trap doors and things in the ceiling. The room was completely sealed. No one could get in, no one could get out. And the medium was strapped down so that he couldn't jump up and do weird things in the dark. And we'll talk about the dark part in a minute here. My red flag until I understood it. And then these scientists documented what they saw. So here's what they saw. The new visitor, Jensen, the drop-in, appeared. Was dressed in a very fine white drapery of many folds hung down to the floor, and the light was radiating from him. We saw him at different places in the room. Once he stood on a sofa, and behind him was a red light which was similar to a little sun with whitish light streaming out from it. This sight I shall never forget. Frequently he managed to appear 7 or 8 times the same evening in different places in the room. Many times we saw the medium and this materialized being simultaneously. The Bishop of Iceland and the British Council attended a seance. Along with 40 sitters, they witnessed Jensen materialize 11 times in bright luminous light. The bishop declared he was completely convinced that these observations were genuine. And they were able to document so that he had died. He was a real person who had died. They didn't verify all the facts he told, but they knew he was a real person who died. So is this contact from the dead? It would seem so, but this is not simple. The problem is this stuff's been documented, but is this a mass hallucination? I mean, it has some weird concentration of psychic energy in the group manifested this? They just don't know. So here's a guy who won the Nobel Prize in physiology in 1913. Did all kinds of studies in pathological psychology. He was well respected, knew how to conduct rigorous experiments, and devoted his attention to the study of rare physical mediums who produced materializations. And he said that after witnessing many of these, he commented it was just as difficult to understand the materialization of a hand, a finger, or an entire person. I mean, it's the same thing, right? He says, I shall not waste time in stating the absurdities, almost the impossibilities from a psychophysiological point of view of this phenomenon. A living being or living matter formed under our eyes, which has its proper warmth, apparently a circulation of blood, and a physiological respiration, which has also a kind of psychic personality, having a will distinct from the will of the medium, in a word, a new human being. This is surely the climax of not marvels, and nevertheless, it's a fact. Let's see here. I read you all that. So then we have Franek Kluski, a medium from Poland in 1920 who did 11 seances and materialized forms with human faces. They used rigid controls with the top scientists and skeptics of the time present. 84 witnesses over these seances recognized dead friends and relatives. So here's the interesting part. So there was a light from like a mirrored like plaque. It was so good that I could see the pores and down on the skin of their faces and hands. On the nose of an older male apparition, I could see clearly the complicated patterns made by the crooked, tiny red blood vessels. I could examine closely the texture of the material of their clothes. I examined a number of them at such close distance that I could hear their breathing and feel their breath upon my face. Through ingenious experiments that may provide the most convincing evidence ever for the reality of materialized forms, they created a permanent record of their existence. Oh, this is fascinating. So they placed a circular tank containing a layer of hot liquid paraffin wax over an electric heater in the center of the circle and asked the beings to dip their materialized hands into the hot wax, making thin gloves. The sitters could hear the sound of something splashing in the wax, and wax would splatter on the floor. Sometimes a wax-covered hand would touch them after dipping into the hot pot. The forms would then dissolve their hands from the dried wax, dropping the empty glove in the sitter's lap or onto the table. They were fragile, thinner than a sheet of paper. So what did they do? They poured plaster in them and made little molds. Unbelievable. So, also, a couple of these wax forms, they added dye to the wax, so they wanted to see if somebody in the room was faking it. Nobody got dye on them. And after the wax cooled and they made the plaster molds, they discovered they had 7 hands, 1 foot, and a mouth and a chin, and the hands and the foot were the size of a child, but only adults were present, normal-sized adults. Was this surviving souls, or was this a collective group psychic phenomena? However, these apparitions interacted, spoke, touched, and felt solid. Some felt warm to the touch, some felt cold to the touch. So then there's the issue of ectoplasm, which I always just think is just weird and creepy. But it's interesting. Ectoplasm is a substance exuded from the mouth of a medium. It's like a little smoky thing going on. A whitish steam, perhaps luminous, taking the shape of gauze or muslin, in which there develops a hand or an arm that gradually gains consistency. The ectoplasm makes personal movements. It creeps, rises from the ground, puts forth tentacles like an amoeba. It's not always connected to the body of the medium, but usually emanates from her and is connected with her. Without the help of the hands or knees, a flowing white substance emerged from the medium's mouth, which was inclined to the left. It was 20 inches long and 8 inches broad. It lay on the breast of the dress, spread out, and formed a white head-like disc with a face profile turned to the right, of life size. Then the materializing powers of Mr. Harris are astounding, unique, and entirely above suspicion. This is this famous psychic Alec Harris in 1952. He worked for years with family and friends and took no money and wanted no notoriety. He agreed to be studied by Dr. Theodore Harhoff from Oxford, who spent years debunking frauds. And he said that I make these statements after many years of investigation and many disappointments and experience of fraudulent mediums. He described the materialization of a Greek philosopher he had worked with who came close to him and spoke in ancient Greek using the correct pronunciation, which is different from that of modern Greek. The ectoplasm, which issues in abundance from Harris's body and which the etheric entities use to make themselves visible, streams like a mist and assumes all sorts of shapes, yet can be compacted into something absolutely solid while the power lasts, and what amazing power it is. This was studied by Albert Fletcher Desborough, who was a stage illusionist and a debunker, and he said there was no fraud. And then he saw his dead father and called him by his family nickname. He saw his brother, who had been shot in the ankle, and this entity limped, came up to him and shook his hand during the seance. This is the dead brother. And they asked the medium why. Why did his dead brother appear as a solid human being and shake his hand? And the medium said because he was an unbeliever. And then this solid person dissolved and sank to the floor. They had journalists with 2 cameras in the room. And they jumped at him and grabbed him and damaged him. I guess you can't touch this ectoplasm because it's something vital you're not supposed to touch. The figure dematerialized, and the medium cried out in pain, and the ectoplasm violently returned to his body with the impact of a sledgehammer. He became very ill, was under medical care for months, and took 2 years before he came to himself again. Weird. This was in 1961. So there's still huge unanswered questions. We know, have documented, can prove that gifted mediums can materialize objects. It's on the record. So why couldn't this all be a group psychic thing and not the survival of the dead? David Fontana, who I mentioned before, a longtime English investigator, says we must consider the possibility that this is psychic phenomena. I could go into all kinds of grandiose theories of my own and tell mediums the experiences they have are not what they think they are, but there are grave dangers in that, just as there are in the rest of psychology. If you try to dictate to people and say that you know their experience better than they know it themselves. So from the point of view of the medium, the answer to the question is clear. Survival is a fact and people are communicating. This is what all the mediums say. The philosopher Michael Sudanti in 2016 said it's not inconceivable that mediums have misinterpreted their own experience. I mean, that's possible, but there's no denying that it all happened. The question is how and why. Charles Rickett, who we've talked about, a Nobel Prize winning scientist, says that a mechanical energy of an unknown kind should emanate from the human body and move a table and shake a piece of board is not entirely incomprehensible, but that this force should produce word-making sound, lights, and living human forms. This indeed goes beyond all our concepts of the possible. A warm and living hand, a mouth that speaks, eyes that see, and thought that thrills like the hand, the mouth, the eyes, and the thought of a human being. These are phenomena that put us into utter confusion. And for such phenomena as materialization, since this is not the medium, what can it be but some external intelligence, some entity with a mind and thoughts of its own? And what can that be but a spirit? Howard Carrington explains apparitions as possible proof of survival, non-physical intelligence linked by the medium to the material world. When hands and face and forms appear, when the conversations are carried on with these forms in a language unknown to the medium, about matters private and unknown to her, it seems preposterous to attempt to explain these facts in any other way than to admit that a spiritual entity is present and active. The spirited hypothesis is the only one that in any way explains the facts, and I shall accordingly adopt it until some better explanation is forthcoming. So these are the manifestations of the impossible. Chapter 25, My Astonishing Second Personal Experiment. And this is Leslie again. In his 2010 memoir, an English medium, Stuart Alexander, wrote an extraordinary journal. And he believes that his purpose as a medium is to let spirit people enter our world and demonstrate that we survive after death. In 1968, at the age of 22, he became intrigued and spent several years researching. He formed his own home circle to see if they could manifest anything as a group, and they met many months with nothing happening. Same people, every night for months. However, suddenly, one time, he was taken over by a control guide, White Feather. And after 10 years, Whitefeather, I can't believe this amount of time they put with nothing happening. After 10 years, Whitefeather spoke regularly through a megaphone, which is it's just this little tube funnel thing that hung in the air, but a voice would come out of it. Eventually, things began to appear and disappear. Then he had a second control called Christopher, who was a child, who could do book tests. Look on the third shelf to the left, the fifth book, page 9, that kind of thing. Eventually, Stuart was able to go into such a deep trance that objects screwed into his flesh didn't harm him, and when he woke, there was no mark. In 92, a new control, Walter Stinson, a Canadian who had died in a train accident in 1911, came in. And he said he'd been the brother of the famous Boston medium Marjorie Crandon, who died in 1941, who had been the subject of much rigorous testing. And finally, the control Frida Johnson came in. So Stuart had this team of guides who spoke through him. Then a Dr. Barnett was able to speak independently of Stuart and materialize during seances and heal people. Stuart kept his family life separate from this. They didn't even know that he was doing this, and they didn't know that he was so successful. In fact, his sons didn't know about it till his book came out in 2010. He's had the same home circle for over 30 years. He avoids publicity. So Kean began emailing him and emailed him for months. She's a journalist. And finally, he invited her to come speak at his yearly retreat. He would have a small group of people doing psychic things. And he invited her after that to sit in on his home circle. Now, most mediums who do this kind of thing need to work in darkness, and there's an explanation. It's not because they're engaging in fraud, which is what I assumed. It's because it's like seeds that germinate need to germinate in the dark before they produce a plant, and then they need sunlight. And the manifestations that are brought forward by mediums need the darkness to not distract their energy. Was a red flag for skeptics, and David Fontana explains here, probably better than I did. Many natural phenomena, the germination of seeds, gestation in the uterus, and the development of images on a photographic plate take place in the absence of light or only a dim red light. And light rays are extremely energetic and liable to disintegrate and disrupt any excessively fine and subtle body. Extraordinarily, it happens at all, and darkness is really not the issue. It's the fact that it happens that's the issue. So Stuart extensively was studied for fraud, and in this circle that's met for 27 years, he told her that he told Leslie, you don't scrap logic and reason. It should never be sacrificed under any circumstance. He wasn't trying to talk her into believing in all this. This room that they did this in, there was nothing hidden in it, no way in, no out. Now this is my favorite part. This is mind-blowing. She brought her own thick cable ties, and they tied him with the cable ties to a chair, and tight enough where it was indenting his skin. So he describes that when these control guides show up, he feels a tugging on his solar plexus and something at the top of his head. The spirits say that they disconnect his mind from his brain. That the brain is just the physical instrument for the mind to use, and it's not the source of the mind, that consciousness can be separated. This is what the message is. Each entity changed Stuart's body language and his voice. And she's sitting watching this. So she was told by the entity Walter to sit beside Stuart and put her hand over Stuart's hand, which was zip-tied to the chair. She said she could feel his hand, and she could feel the zip-tie cable securely tying him down. And Walter caused Stuart's hand, with Leslie's hand on top of it, zip-tied to the chair, her hand on top of it. Suddenly his hand rose up, the zip tie went through his hand. She saw it happen. His hand went up in the air, about this high up. And she looked down and the cable tie was unbroken, still on the chair. And then fell to the ground. His hand came down. And a new zip tie wrapped itself and tied itself. And she watched the whole thing happen. It's just mind-boggling. Here's a better description. Walter immediately said to feel the strap on the arm of the chair with my other hand, while my left hand remained in the air, still holding on to Stuart. The cable tie remained, still locked in place, unbroken, just as I felt it a second before when Stuart's arm was inside it. I had just witnessed a phenomenon, living matter through matter. Stuart's arm moved right through the locked cable tie, which remained closed on the arm of the chair. This experiment was performed many times, and I spoke to 2 sitters who once observed it with the red light. Walter then passed the intact cable tie, still closed, through the solid arm of the chair and said, "It's yours, take it." So this was matter through matter, but not living matter. "Is there a spare strap on the table?" Walter asked. This was, to me, the most startling part of all. We could hear the rasping, clicking sound of a new cable tie being pulled through the ratchet that locked it onto Stuart's arm and the arm of the chair, replacing the one that I had in my hand. This maneuver takes 2 hands. No one in the room had moved. There was no other sound in the silence. Somehow, a new opened cable tie had been transported from the table and secured onto Stuart's arm again. I then felt the new strap tightly locked around his arm, pinching into his flesh. So, let's see here. Leslie narrated out loud everything that she heard. She brought a digital recorder thing and narrated everything. The control, Frida, told her that all of this is dependent on ectoplasm, which is a vital energy substance that is both spiritual and physical. It's part of the medium and part of the spirit world, and they use ectoplasm to vibrate the atmosphere to create sound, and that's how they are able to produce the weird sounds that they make. So this ectoplasm came out of the person, formed a fog. She saw it grow. She saw it turn into a hand. It reached out. It touched her. It shook her hand. And then it returned again. This is what the process looks like. Came out of the medium. Came more and more and more. And shook her hand. It had weight, felt like a hand. She said she could see the creases in the skin. She says this is strange, and she's just reporting what she saw. These materializations have been scientifically documented under strict controls. She describes the manifestation of this Dr. Barnett, a solid blocked glow of luminescent... Okay, so the medium has luminescent knee pads, so that in the dark, you can see that he's still sitting there. And this Dr. Barnett appeared, control, a spirit appeared, and walked around the room. People heard it, and she said you could see as it was walking, and it walked past the medium. It blocked the glow of the knee pad, and then there was the knee pad, and it blocked the next one, and then there was the knee pad. I mean, it was solid. It touched her head as it went by. She's like, okay. And he explained it this way later. They explained that it's like a piece of bamboo. If you take a stick of bamboo and you move it, you can just watch the bamboo. But if you vibrate it fast enough, you can't see it. And it's a difference in vibratory levels, the spirit world and our world. And that's why we can't see them. But if they can slow themselves down and you can raise yourself up, Sometimes you can see them. Let's see here. So they brought a lot of personal messages in the process of working with this medium to many different people, and to skeptics that blew their mind. One guy came to be part of it and had been to the doctor and had an echocardiogram and had cardiomyopathy. And this spirit guide healed him. It told him, you're better. Whatever was wrong with you is gone. And he's just, a skeptic and thought it was crazy. And he had already had an appointment to check with his doctor again soon after. And the doctor said, what did you do? Your heart's cured. It's better. So Kean said that sometimes at the seances, nothing would happen. Nothing would appear. There'd be no sound. There'd be no healing. So Stuart guy, the medium, describes a book test that he did for a guy who came to England from the United States, which was 100% accurate. And this kind of supports the survival argument, because who's getting mind read when the information in the mind of the sitter has absolutely nothing to do with what words are written on what page of what book on what shelf? That's just too weird. So the next chapter, A Life in Two Worlds by Stuart Alexander, the medium, and he said he can't be sure that this is not all part of his unconscious. He doesn't know. But decades of interaction between the entities and the sitter have suggested forcefully to him that they are denizens from the next world. He was worried that he was fooling himself when that white feather first came, that he'd tried for so long. But then his grandmother spoke to him at another medium's seance, and then white feather spoke, and then through the other medium. And Stuart asked this this other medium, when their contact had a malformed hand, and this is psychically, right? And Stuart said, well, what's wrong with your hand? And he had no way of knowing that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So this is not had special red light cameras used, because he doesn't like people to come in and take photographs with special red light cameras. And the reason is, he says, that he doesn't want his family disrupted. And he's seen what's happened to other mediums who've cooperated. There's lots of other mediums who've cooperated, but they get hounded, and they read their names in the National Enquirer, and people call them frauds, and it's really pretty awful. He doesn't want any notoriety. He doesn't want any disruption of his family life. He said every medium he's ever known who's cooperated has been the subject of vicious controversy, and he wants no part of that. But they did do some private medical studies, and nothing. So no fraud. So Leslie says, what does this mean in terms of my life here and now? I live with the belief that it's essential to cause no one harm, to help others, to be true to oneself. I believe that we all have a spark of God within us, God being the all-pure state towards which we are all returning. We are all part of that pure state, and as such, we are all a part of one another. This is actually the medium speaking. And as the spirit guide said, your world is a world of illusion. Our world is the world of ultimate reality. So that was the medium speaking, not Leslie. This longtime researcher says, for millennia, philosophies and wisdom traditions have insisted that consciousness is an irreducible primary property of nature. So to explain away mediumship and other forms of apparent afterlife communication as being caused by psychic ability among the living is to overlook the strong possibility that all psychic functioning occurs within the same general realm or field, which we crudely term the other side or the spirit world. Since copious evidence seems to confirm that consciousness can function independently of the brain, perhaps our true selves actually reside on the other side, whether we are in a physical body or not. If so, then the distinction between deceased people communicating through their psi to a medium and the medium using her own psychic functioning to acquire information may be a false one, since in this view, both sources operate within the same domain. So she says, I'm not a scientist, but I think that if consciousness is non-local and if there are non-physical realms, there would naturally exist outside the confines of the material world and would therefore not be subject to the laws of physics. My only request of those who deny that any of this is possible is to simply look at the evidence with an open mind. And Dr. Broud says that he's uniquely situated to recognize the intellectual cowardice and dishonesty he came to see in the severe skeptics because he had previously observed these traits in himself. They are demons with whom I am intimately acquainted, he said. I am hardly comfortable about announcing to my academic colleagues that I believe, for example, that accordions can float in midair playing melodies, or that hands may materialize, move objects, and then dissolve or disappear. But I have reached my present position only after satisfying myself that no reasonable options remain. Actually, I find that my discomfort tends to diminish as I discern more clearly how little the most derisive and condescending skeptics really know about the evidence, and how their apparent confidence in their opinions is little more than posturing and dishonest bluffing. And in conclusion, Leslie says, I hope this book has opened doors that will allow you to engage meaningfully in that process of investigation, and to take some solace in the fact that there is abundant mystery all around us and that death may very well not be the end. The end. So that's our book, Surviving Death by Leslie Kean, who also wrote UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. This is a fantastic book. And her boyfriend, Bud Hopkins, this is one of his books. I could tell you the name of some of the others. This is the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions, and it's a mind blower. Okay, this is, Intruders. He wrote a book called Intruders. So that's it for this book, and I have next week's book all ready to go, and hopefully a conversation next week. Still negotiating the time schedules, And I hope you enjoyed that. And as I promised, it's a mind blower. And, here's a journalist with quite the reputation to lose who swears up and down that she sat in a room and watched disembodied hands floating around and touching people. And she saw a person appear as the result of a medium, solid like a human being walking around the room, body blocking light, reaching out and touching people, and then just sort of sparkling away. So I don't know. Pretty interesting stuff. Thank you very much for watching. If you stuck through all these videos, you're a brave person. I appreciate very much the support. I always enjoy doing these books. You guys are great. It's heartening to know there are people out there who value the written word and like these interesting topics. I think they're really interesting and very much appreciated. So tomorrow, I have a little something up my sleeve. Maybe. We'll see how it goes. And in the meantime, thank you for watching. Have a good rest of your Saturday. Slán go fóill and slánte.